This is a book review of this book, Technofeudalism, What Killed Capitalism. And yeah, he's actually going to make an argument in this book that capitalism is already dead. And it's pretty compelling. This book read like a thriller to me, like an economic thriller romp through history to see like what capitalism's dead, what happened, how did that happen. And he's actually a socialist and has been a socialist sort of all his life, as was his father. And he's writing the book to his father, who is now deceased, where he's thinking back to a moment in the 1990s when the internet came on the scene. And him and his father at that point had a conversation that was kind of like, will the internet kill capitalism? And of course, they were thinking of it as this like hopeful thing. Oh yeah, they're socialists. They're hopeful that the internet could actually kill capitalism. And he's looking back and saying, actually, capitalism is dead. The internet was definitely one of the forces here. It's actually cloud capitalism is the way he's going to describe it. But despite that being the case, it's not necessarily a positive thing. It's not what they'd hoped for in the 1990s when they had that conversation. Rather, it's a system that is now technofeudalism, as he's making the analogy. And he has even a whole chapter in the book saying, why can't we just call this new system something capitalism, like cloud capitalism or platform capitalism? And he says, no, that's not actually going to work because the change that has happened in the economy is so fundamental that we need a new word, and kind of bringing back feudalism to make this a techno-feudalist economic system is actually a better match for describing what's going on. That's the basic premise. And of course, this relates to my channel because I'm thinking through paradigm shifts in economics, governance, and knowledge systems. And so if we ask the question, why is the economy ready for a paradigm shift in our economic system? Well, to answer that, you actually need to know what is the history of the economic system, how has it evolved, and where is it right now that we might want a paradigm shift there. And this is basically the history of how our economy has evolved and ended up where we are now. I'm mainly in this video going to sort of go through and explain in a chronological order this murder mystery where it ends with the death of capitalism. So we'll start in the Middle Ages, like what is feudalism, and then we'll move into capitalism, what is capitalism, and then he actually zones in on a moment in history in the mid-20th century that I think is a crucial moment for the way the economy is evolving. In fact, he's actually obsessed with the same book I was obsessed with. I did a whole video on this, and I think this book actually fundamentally describes how the economy had evolved in the mid-20th century. And then we'll talk about a few shifts that happened in the economy after Bretton Woods, after the dollar was delinked from gold, financialization, private equity, sort of how the economy evolved, say, in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And then cloud capital comes on the scene, and this is, of course, the kind of capital that will fundamentally shift the nature of the economy. So we'll look at that, we'll look at a world after the 2008 financial crisis, as he does, and ask the question, why is this so fundamentally different that it is no longer capitalism? And then he relates this to the new Cold War between the US and China. So I'll briefly explain that. And then he does end the book with a sense of hope, a sense for how do we get out from under the thumb of techno-feudalism. And I appreciate his approach there, so I'll explain that at the end. All right, so we'll start with the transition from feudalism to capitalism. And of course, to do that, we have to know what are those two things. And we might first want to think about what are economic transitions in general. And he relates this to the question of who commands in an economy and who obeys. And he even harkens back to the Iron Age, where the people who had the power to command were the people who had iron as this input. Like they had superior weapons, people who didn't have the iron had to bend to the will of those who had it. And economic situations are going to be similar in that sense, where feudalism sort of gave the power to command to people who owned land and people with just superior access to weapons. And here's a quote from him. "Until fairly recently, it was that precise combination of land and sophisticated weaponry that decided who did what to whom, who had power, and who had to obey. That was feudalism." In which case, what is capitalism? Because it's not like capital itself did not exist like way back into antiquity. Capital is just stuff that has the ability to produce more stuff. So it's like machinery, like the plow, that's capital. So certainly the plow existed before capitalism. In which case, what is capitalism? And it's where the power to command shifted from the land ownership over to the ownership of the factories and the capital that made up the greatest part of the economy. So he breaks down power into several different categories, where the first is going to be just brute force, like military power, or just the threat of violence of some kind. That's the first type of power. Now, these others, I think I want to quote from him because he defines them in a way that's so precise and so helpful. Second, political or agenda-setting power. The capacity to determine who is represented in the forums where collective decisions are reached, what is being debated, discussed, and decided upon in those forums, and what issues remain unspoken, tacit, buried across society. Third, soft or propaganda power. The power to shape what others think, are prepared to tolerate, to wish for, and ultimately to do. So of course that would include religious power. Capitalism added capitalist power. Instead of the threat of violence, the threat of taking away the means to one's livelihood. And he sees this dual nature of capital, where it's both a thing, like something that produces stuff, but it's also the power to command other people, including perhaps people who are not immediately sort of in your company or whatnot. It's a very powerful thing. The capitalists graduated from being employers to agenda setters wherever big decisions were being made. Under feudalism, the power of the ruling class grew out of owning land that the majority could not own, but were bound to. Under capitalism, power stemmed from owning capital that the majority did not own, but had to work with to make a living. Under technofeudalism, a new ruling class draws power from owning capital whose tentacles entangle everyone. But of course, capitalism evolved. And by the mid-20th century, we had something that was a little bit closer to what John Kenneth Galbraith describes in The New Industrial State. And he calls this the technostructure. Now, I will say, it was so incredibly validating for me that this book was such an important part of his vision as well, because I had never read this author. And yet, when I encountered this book, this felt to me like something that was like, wow, fundamental. Like it was describing a structure of the economy that was real and that was not fully modeled by economists in the way we classically build models. Now, what is the technostructure? And he doesn't, I think, fully flesh it out in this book. I'll link below to my video on this, but the way he describes it is that the technostructure is the way the corporate sector wields soft power, like propaganda power. And during that time, of course, the advertising industry began to balloon, and a lot of the focus of the industry really was about how to influence the values, the hopes, the dreams, and I think the pathways of upward mobility for people in general. And he says the technostructure is personified by a character in Mad Men. Let me read you a quote here. Don Draper explains his theory of love to date. What you call love was invented by guys like me to sell nylons. And he describes this as the rise of highly professionalized behavior modification sectors. And that behavior modification was focused both at the consumer, like through regular advertising, but also at the producer, at what people viewed as the way to move up economically in society. Like major markets for people's attention and also markets for influencers sort of rose up and became important parts of the economy during this time. Now, there are some parts of this book that do not appear in this book, or certainly are not emphasized. So I do want to draw a little bit of attention to that. And one way I would describe this is that humans have like a natural desire to do good things for their fellow man. Like there is this sort of altruistic part of the human soul. And one part of the rise of the corporate technostructure is that people who sort of rose within corporations, which he describes as moving like toward the center of the corporation, it's both that those people had to get on board with sort of the moral goals or the social goals of that corporation. But also there's kind of this two-way street. Like the corporations could not just dictate what the social goals would be. Rather, they had to take the social goals that were naturally on people's hearts, which included really good social goals. And they had to kind of increase the emphasis on things that the technostructure could help with, that would actually feed the technostructure's growth, and de-emphasize the types of social goals or the elements of a social goal that were not well served by the technostructure, or that could threaten the power of the technostructure in some way. And essentially, through this process, this reciprocal process between the employees and the corporations, and especially sort of the professional managerial class in these corporations, that created the values that led to upward mobility in society. So if you're going to be educated and you're going to sort of plan to move up inside the system, you kind of have to get on board with the values and the moral structure of that comes out of this process of corporations emphasizing and de-emphasizing in ways that the professional managerial class can get on board with. This book also does not mention the relationship between the corporate sector and the government sector, which is part of the technostructure. It's like this mutually beneficial relationship where both groups are just trying to expand the size of their organizations, expand the scope and reach of their pro-social mission, perhaps at the expense of any pro-social value that threatens the power of this whole growing ecosystem. I could go on and on about this, but I'll stop there. But what I will say is, in thinking about the technostructure, we do want to preview how this might show up in the modern environment in a slightly different way. And you can probably figure out where this is going. He's basically saying the technology of cloud capital, which includes networks of people and access to people and pathways of upward mobility, what people view to be the moral frame of all of society, that is supercharged by cloud capital. Like the things that people in the technostructure were trying to do through their advertising environment and through restructuring sort of the social fabric of people's lives through their own companies, through their own corporations. There were limitations back in the 1970s that are overcome by the existence of cloud capital. Okay, so our next plot point in this story of the economy is going to be Bretton Woods and the Nixon shock. And one thing that I found interesting about the fact that he identified this moment as a particular type of change point was that other thinkers, including David Graeber, who wrote Debt, I hope to do a video on this one soon, also see this as a major change point in economic history. So this is something that's validated by other thinkers. Now, the way he thinks about change point moments like this, I think is really helpful because it's grounded in evolutionary theory. And of course, the economy is an evolutionary thing. So let me read you a quote. Oh, and in this quote, he's talking about shocks like the Nixon shock, like the 2008 financial crisis, like a few other moments like financialization. He's talking about shocks and the way it's not that the economy immediately changes following those shocks. It's just that those shocks provide the mutations around which the economy will move. None of these developments overthrew capitalism, but can be thought of as mutations in its DNA that led to a series of remarkable metamorphoses as it adapted and evolved. Now, what is this metamorphosis that will evolve out of that mutation? And he calls this the Minotaur. And the Minotaur is in reference to the myth where a society had to send a bunch of young people to this monster, the Minotaur, so that those young people could be sacrificed to the Minotaur. And as long as that happened, the Minotaur would not destroy society. That's sort of the gist of the myth. And this relates to another book that he wrote, which I haven't read yet, which is of that title, The Minotaur. But he gives a sense for what is going to happen during this era, which I kind of think of as, okay, post-Bretton Woods and before Cloud Capital, even though this is obviously going to continue through the Cloud Capital era. And two things that happened during the era of the global Minotaur are financialization and private equity. So it's not that these are the only two things happening, but they're kind of representative of the kinds of changes in the economy that started to channel money toward those who are already wealthy, or those who, in my opinion, owned the institutions or the capital, the financial capital, whatever, the fire sector. This is basically the money pump, is the name that Peter Turchin gives for this, which is pumping money in a certain direction in the economy. So let me describe his view of these two things. First off, there's financialization. And of course, the representative type of asset that's a financialized asset is the mortgage-backed security that people are more familiar with because that was sort of one of the key starring role players in the 2008 financial crisis. And a mortgage-backed security, of course, is taking 100 different mortgages for their houses that people have signed and slicing those mortgages up into 100 pieces each so that one person's $1,000 payment for their mortgage every month moves in 100 different directions toward different assets. And of course, some of those mortgages are mortgages where everybody kind of knows that person will go bankrupt. But because that mortgage has been hidden as 1/100th of this other asset that's maybe clustered with some other assets, it's this tiny portion, nobody really sees what's going on, or nobody at least calls it out. It seems legitimate until the system kind of collapses around it. And of course, stuff like this was going on way before 2008. And that's kind of one of the points he's making here, is that actually computers and technology and complication of how the financial system worked, that's all kind of working together to provide the smoke and mirrors of legitimacy for these assets. So let me read you a quote. From the late 1970s onwards, bankers shrouded their debt-fueled bets in layers of computer-generated complexity that made the gargantuan risks invisible. Complexity thus became a great excuse not to delve into the derivatives that one bought. And it's not too hard to see how financialization actually maps pretty well onto classic Ricardian rent. So Ricardo was an economist in the early 1800s when he was writing, and he had this analogy that sort of explained how rent works. And of course, rent is going to have a starring role in killing capitalism, so I might as well explain it here while we're talking about financialization. So the classic analogy is the river with rent, where an economic system that sort of served everybody well might have people who are fishermen pulling fish out of the water, getting paid in ways that were roughly aligned with the value they're offering the population through the fish that they get for the population. That's sort of like an idealized situation. Rent happens when somebody comes along who owns a portion of the river where a lot of the fish are swimming. And instead of just letting this thing happen, this person is going to put up ropes and put up chains and have kind of a toll booth for any fisherman who wants to fish out of that part of the river. If you want to fish there, you have to pay a toll to the person who owns that part of the river. In other words, the value added to the economy, like to the real value that humans experience through eating fish, what the rentier is doing is not in any way related to creating value for people. The rentier is just taking the value that's created by other people and channeling more of the resources toward the rentier themselves. So if you think of the economy as a pie, then if economic activity actually makes the whole pie bigger so that everybody can enjoy the benefits theoretically, that's not rent. But if what's happening, if the only thing this economic activity is doing is increasing the share of the pie that moves toward the rentier, that is rent. Now, are bankers more rentiers, or are they more adding value to the economy? And of course, you might imagine my answer and his answer to that question. But bankers can actually create real value if what they're doing is sort of discerning which small business owners have potential, which of them are using resources frugally or beneficially to the community they live in. If the banker is discerning that, then they're actually contributing to something that makes the pie bigger. But if the banker is just sort of taking a cut of all of these resources that would get allocated optimally anyway, then that's more of a rent activity. Many people will refer to the legitimate version of the banker's role as Main Street bankers, whereas the financialization, sort of the rent-seeking version, as the Wall Street bankers. And of course, the complexity, the computerization, the fact that assets are moving money in and out of many different hands, where each of those hands is a banker taking a cut. That's very much a rentier role. Now, why is it legitimate to do some of this fancy rent-seeking financialization? And in a lot of ways, the bankers are sort of hiding behind the legitimate version of the banker, like the Main Street version of the banker, in order to legitimize the rent-seeking that is the financialized Wall Street version of bankers. And this gets at the notion of economic myths. Like, we definitely need economic myths for people to understand the systems we belong inside. These are myths of sort of how does the system work, what is legitimate and not. Those are necessary. But sometimes those myths, which sometimes come from economics textbooks, can be used to legitimize things that shouldn't be legitimized, that don't have an accountability mechanism to stop rent seeking. And of course, that's a big part of this whole story. Now let's move on to private equity, which is another little subplot of what's happening in the 1980s and the 1990s and all thereabouts. And this book is actually a great book sort of explaining some of this and explaining what it looks like. And I'm going to explain it in a way that is a cross between these two books, where you have somebody who works for a nursing home. We'll call her Jillian, which is the name he uses. And a private equity firm comes up and buys the nursing home she's working at. Like, she's a nurse's aide, she helps the residents, all of that. And at first, nothing changes. And I think this is actually kind of an important part of the story, because if the private equity firm came along and immediately things looked kind of suspicious and weird and like devastating to the community, I think you would get a different amount of backlash than you get the way these things actually play out. So at first, it's not that much change. The company just separates into two companies, where one company owns the machines and the beds and the land, the buildings, all of that. And the other company owns the workers. Like that's the only change that happens, and it doesn't change Jillian's life. But then there starts to be some suspicious things going on. For example, the private equity company changes the rules such that the nursing home can only buy food from this particular food company. It's like a frozen food company. They do a lot of food. And the weird thing about that is the food company that the nursing home now can only buy from happens to also be owned by the same private equity firm. So even though the private equity firm owns two businesses in different industries, food industry and nursing home industry, it is setting internal rules for the nursing home that the nursing home has to channel money in the direction of the food company. So So like that smells kind of like monopoly power. Like it smells kind of weird. But economists actually don't have a lot of language to describe this kind of phenomenon when it's cross industries that just are owned by one company. And the first time I encountered this, it was in the book Radical Markets. I was like, whoa, why haven't I learned about this in my PhD program as an economist? And that's just an interesting question. Okay, but let's continue our story with Jillian. So eventually there's a meeting in the nursing home where Jillian works, and they tell her, actually, if you don't work more hours for a little bit lower pay, then this whole nursing home is going to have to go bankrupt. We're going to have to not exist. So what do you want? Do you want the nursing home to not exist, or do you want to squeeze yourself a little bit more in terms of your ability to give and your ability to receive compensation? And that goes on for a while, and finally the nursing home eventually does go bankrupt. And let me read you a quote on this. The private equity firm that cost Jillian her job has practiced straightforward asset stripping, with Financialization providing the necessary smoke and mirrors. Now, I'd like to move ahead in our story, actually to the 2008 financial crisis. Now, I will say cloud capital was beginning to be a thing in the early 2000s, but I'd like to not go there just yet, because since I just talked about private equity, I think having that fresh in our minds is helpful for thinking about the type of mutation in the economy that the 2008 financial crisis brought. And once again, in our evolutionary economic thinking, we realize the mutations don't immediately blow up the way the economy works. Rather, they sort of insert different structures that will slowly change the economy as the economy moves in and fills in the gaps around those new mutations. That's our evolutionary brains at work. Now, he paints the picture that the 2008 financial crisis untethered something. And hint, one thing this is going to be, it actually untethered the economy from profits. And I'll get to that in a second. But for now, I just want to say two things about the financial crisis. One is that he asks the question, why were bankers allowed to get away with this? Like, why were no bankers punished when this happened in 2008, when the whole system sort of collapsed a bit because of these mortgage-backed securities and financialization shenanigans? Why? And his answer is that the bankers controlled payment systems and mortgages. So like, they have that leverage over everybody's head. They say, you know what? If you punish us, it might be kind of unfortunate if something happened to the payment systems and the mortgages. Don't you depend on those things? Now, to foreshadow a little bit what happens with cloud capital on the scene, is we might be able to ask the question, could these online digital platforms, could these provide alternative payment mechanisms such that if you did want to punish the bankers, there would be some other financial system that people could rely on? If that were the case, then the cloud capitalists might actually have more leverage than the bankers, maybe. And yes, these questions will potentially relate to a Cold War between the US and China. We're going there, but not just yet. But the other thing I wanted to say about what happened after the 2008 financial crisis relates kind of to this story of private equity. Because you might look at that story and say, why can only private companies do this? Like, why couldn't a corporation do something similar? Now, part of the answer, of course, is that private equity has some protections. Like, it has a bit of an invisibility cloak around it that might not be exactly identical to a corporation. But you can still get similar phenomenon from companies that own companies in many different sectors. And he essentially argues that American capitalism is owned by three different firms. Let me read you a quote. 3 U.S. companies with powers exceeding those of private equity and all terrestrial capitalists put together, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, effectively own American capitalism. The Big Three enjoy unprecedented monopoly power over entire sectors, from airlines and banking to energy and Silicon Valley. And he adds up the dollar value of the money that these firms own and manage and invest in. And what he says is, to make sense of these numbers, they are almost exactly the same as the US national income. But let's talk about cloud capital, because we're kind of getting closer to the climax of this economic murder mystery. And he actually coins a new term, the cloudalists, where he's using that in the same way that people talk about the capitalists, where the capitalists are the people who own the important capital in the economy, like the factories in the 1800s or the big mega corporations everybody's heard of in the 1900s. And of course, this is related to power, like influence and power that he's been talking about all along. Who sets the agenda of the collective decision making? And in his view, it used to be capitalists. It used to be those people. But he's now saying cloud capital is a fundamentally different thing. And therefore, we need to talk about the people who own cloud capital differently from the people who own regular, what he calls terrestrial capital. And so the cloudalists, like if this is a murder mystery, what killed capitalism, we're sort of honing in, zooming in on the people who might be responsible, even if they're not completely aware of it, even if this is like unintentional manslaughter. Actually, let me read you a quote on the unintentional manslaughter, because I think it does help us frame how this whole thing is happening almost under the noses of people who might not want it to happen. Remarkably, as with all historic transformations, no one planned it. No capitalist imagined becoming a cloudalist. No central bankers aimed at funding the cloudalists. No politicians saw the damage cloud capital would inflict upon democratic policies. In the same way that capitalism came about against the will of everyone, including the kings and bishops, as well as the peasants, the rise of cloudalists happened out of sight and behind the back of the vast majority, including the most powerful historical agents. But back to the question, what is cloud capital? And cloud capital, of course, is going to be the servers, the data, and ownership over the networks, like the platforms that shape our lives, that structure the economy, that structure even supply chains, things like that. Now, he does not use the term network capital anytime in this book. And I'm not sure if that's intentional, if he's like trying to avoid jargony words, or what reason, like why wouldn't he do that? But I think in essence, this boils down to network capital. It's like the capital that is control over your access to other people in the network. Like other people that you care about, that you're friends with, other people who are potential customers, potential people to buy from. I think network capital is the best way of describing the power of cloud capital. And part of this is that it's not just the digital networks, it's also the social networks that are having this network power effect. But regardless, if we ask the question, why is cloud capital fundamentally different from terrestrial capital or like the old world capital? And one of the answers that we've basically already gone over is that network capital supercharges the technostructure's job. And of course, you remember the technostructure, it influences people through advertising, it influences workers by showing them what kinds of values they're going to need to move up in the corporate world. And it influences people by, in some ways, kind of structuring values and certainly pathways of upward mobility. Cloud capital is different because it controls access to our social networks and our economic activity, sort of access to our participation in society, what I'm calling network capital. And let me read you a quote. In the 18th century, it was land that many were denied access to. In the 21st century, it is access to their own identity. And it's somewhat true that our identity is deeply tied up in the communities we belong to. And that's both economic communities, like our workplace identity, and also just like social friend groups, all of that. I also think it's worthwhile revisiting here his definition of political power or agenda-setting power. And as I read this, think about how online algorithms, artificial intelligence, how all of that might change this setup, political or agenda-setting power. The capacity to determine who is represented in the forums where collective decisions are reached, what is being debated, discussed, and decided upon in these forums, and what issues remain unspoken, tacit, buried across society. And we can do a similar exercise in thinking through how the cloud economy would restructure the tasks of the old technostructure, of influencing consumers and workers. And when we're thinking about consumers, of course, in the previous era, this was like television advertising. But the algorithms allow what he calls, I think he uses the word something like an infinite regress. This infinite, the algorithms online influence you, you therefore give them your data about what you'll click on, what you'll respond to. It updates the algorithm and sort of gives you something back. And that is definitely a supercharged version of TV ads from the old era. There's also the notion of the digital space determining what gets social accolades, what gets social contempt. And if you sometimes think through, like, what is our world very morally focused on? What is the moral frame of the world we live in? And how much is that shaped by these digital algorithms? When it comes to influence over the workers, there are going to be some spaces where there is a lot of digital sway. And here we might think of Amazon workers and small businesses who post to Amazon. We might think of Mechanical Turk, which is kind of like this digital gig economy. We might think of app developers, where all of these types of workers are sort of under the thumb and potentially channeling some of their own value, their own profit toward the cloudalists, the people who own the cloud capital. And I tend to think of these digital marketplaces for both goods like Amazon, but also for information like social media. I think of these as little mini governments that each firm operates as. Now, that's not necessarily different from the system of the 20th century. Like, firms were always mini governments in some sense of that word. And let me read you a quote here. The cloudalists have acquired the ability to do that which the Edisons, the Westinghouses, and the Fords never could. To turn themselves into a revolutionary class, actively displacing the capitalists from the top of society's pecking order. But are we really no longer in a capitalist economy? Like, what's his case for that? And in the book, this is laid out in a chapter called Why a New Word, where he asks the question, why does the word capitalism absolutely no longer capture what we're in? And he says, what in the simplest possible terms distinguishes this world from the previous one? Demanding that we discard the word capitalism and replace it with technofeudalism. It is very simply this: the triumph of rent over profit. And even with that quote, there's going to be three parts to this story. There's the rent part of the story, there's the untethering of economic success from profits, and then there's the change in markets, or the displacement of markets, with something that is fundamentally different, fundamentally more techno-feudalist. So let's look at all three of these. And when it comes to rent, I've already kind of laid out classic Ricardian rent, where we're thinking about this river with this toll booth for fishermen to have to pay a toll, that is, pay the rent, to whoever owns that section of the river. And that will still apply. But we have to ask the question, what is the difference between rent and profit? And here's what he says about that. Arithmetically, there is no difference. Both rent and profit amount to money left over after costs are paid for. The difference is subtler, qualitative, almost abstract. Profit is vulnerable to market competition. Rent is not. Profit, then, is a mechanism of accountability. Like, the competition over profits leaves firms accountable to providing value to the population. Now, we could say, okay, the profit system actually weighs people's ability to channel the firm's behavior in unequal ways. There's all kinds of critiques of that system. And of course, he's a socialist, so I'm sure he makes those critiques elsewhere. But at least firms are accountable to the population in this one way. And if we go back to our conversation about rent and the share of the economic pie, we could say that actually profit makes the pie bigger by aligning incentives for firms to create value for the population, by pointing competitive environments toward creating things people really want, and by inspiring them to work hard to get that. So there's at least that argument that profits will increase the size of the pie through inspiration, through matching, through accountability, through all of that, whereas rents do not have that effect. Now, a person might say, hasn't capitalism always had rent as part of what's going on? And he has two answers to that, where one is, under capitalism, rent is sort of held in check by government regulation. And then his second answer is, yeah, there's some rent in capitalism, but it's sort of a small share of what's going on relative to this whole profits story. He says, in capitalism, rent survived only parasitically on and in the shadows of profit. That changed after 2008. Now, what about this second part of the story? This untethering of economic success from profit. And he talks about this moment between him and his dad in the summer of 2020, where they looked at the national income of the UK dropping by 20% and everybody losing their jobs, while the stock market actually went up a little bit. Billionaires were gaining tons while everyone else was suffering. And he saw this as this question mark. He saw it as something that was a puzzle to be figured out. And so he's watching things, trying to figure out what's going on. And then in 2021, we have this. In 2021, Goldman Sachs stunned the financial world by publishing a non-profitable technology index, which perfectly demonstrates capitalism's emancipation from profits. In which case, that was another "that's weird" moment for him. And that's, of course, how science works. Scientists sort of pay attention to their experiments, and a lot of breakthroughs come when somebody notices something is just kind of weird and investigates. So he's noticing these interesting facts that don't quite fit with the old economic story. Now, why isn't this apparent? Why isn't it being discussed? And part of the story there has to do with the incentives for people to not see what's going on. Let me read you a quote. What all these mega rentiers have in common is a strong motive to legitimize their rents by disguising them as profits, something akin to profit washing their rents. And he's using the term profit washing here in a way that's kind of similar to money laundering when you hear that term used, where it's kind of like he's saying, okay, these rentiers, they don't want people to notice because they need people to buy into whatever they're doing. So they're like, oh, actually, no, we're totally competitive. We're getting all the money in our direction because we're doing the best job. And if some competitor came along and did a better job, actually they would be winning. But we're just winning based on our merit. This is just profit. It's not really rent. And we might recall the smoke and mirrors that was complexity in this age of financialization. And the painting of these rents as profits is kind of in the same vein. It's the smoke and mirrors that sort of hides behind something that is legitimate, according to many people, to get away with something that is just plain rent-seeking. And he points out that all throughout history, when there's been these bubbles, like these fake bubbles where things are overvalued for reasons that aren't based on real economic value, sometimes the way money flows during those bubbles will actually build things of lasting value. Like, I'm sure if you look back at the tulip bubble, that some people built homes and estates during that bubble, where when the bubble popped, the homes and estates were still in existence. And he's kind of saying the same thing with cloud capital, that even though perhaps there's something bubble-like or fake about what's going on, the infrastructure of cloud capital, like these platforms that are being built, that is real and that will survive whatever fake story and fake legitimization might be going on. But what about markets? Like, is he really saying that markets no longer exist? And little by little, capitalism's two great pillars, profit and markets, are being replaced. What does he mean markets are being replaced? Like, what's going on with that? And his first answer has to do with the economic value that's being created on these platforms, that it's not actually sold to the population, to the people on a market. Search results are not produced to be sold. Alexa and Siri do not answer our questions for a fee. Like Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, WhatsApp, their purpose is entirely different: to capture and modify our attention. In other words, this is all about soft power. And of course, some people might look at that and say, wait a second, there's still a market, there's still a competitive market. It's just not the thing that people interact with. The competitive market happens when they sell our attention to the advertisers, to the people who want to influence us. But if you go back to this notion of the market and profits as a mechanism of accountability, as a mechanism that sort of holds businesses accountable to creating value to the population, if a greater and greater share of that situation is not accountable to the people, but is rather accountable to those who want to influence us, to those who want to wield soft power over the population, like what ratio of those, like value to the people that's really thinking about what the people like and value versus attention paid to those who want to influence, what ratio of that would lead to something where you're kind of like, this is no longer how accountable markets should and would work? And there's a bit of a parallel to what we talked about earlier with bankers. How like the legitimate version of the banker thinks about small businesses and tries to help match the needs of the population to which small businesses get a loan, which of them get to try, which of them get to thrive. Like, that's a healthy version of a banker. But as we move up into financialization and Wall Street, we start to get several steps removed from value that's aimed at real people. And it's like the same thing is going on with cloud capital, because you could have value that's directly accountable to the population. But when it starts to be several steps removed on the back end, where the markets and attention and purpose of what's being built is aimed at those who want power over others, then the few steps that you're removing it from the needs of the population, those actually might matter. Like, when we build new technology, whose needs do we want to be thinking about? He says, I have become more skeptical of narratives that place too much emphasis on technology and not enough on how powerful groups seize and manipulate it to achieve and maintain dominance over others. Now, we might counteract these arguments by saying, well, what about Amazon? Isn't that like a classic market? And he says, commerce platforms like Amazon.com and Alibaba are not markets. The reason they cannot be thought of as markets is that the cloudalists' algorithms succeed in isolating every buyer from every other buyer, every seller from every other seller. As a result, the cloudalists' algorithm concentrates in itself the power to match buyers and sellers, which is exactly the opposite of what a market is meant to be, decentralized. And that is a kind of subtle point. Like the fact that markets require individual actors to be able to interact freely with each other, rather than only interact if they go through this sort of rent-seeking mechanism to be matched with somebody else. Like, it's a subtle difference, but it's real. And it does get at this notion of these platforms as mini governments, where they may want something of their own in order to match members of the market. Now, what about the new Cold War between the US and China? And I think the right way of thinking about how he characterizes this is that it's a fictional story that represents an economic model. Like, it's got representative agents, and just like an economic model, it's an oversimplified version of reality. But I do think reality at least partially maps onto this fictional story. So I'll tell that story. And there's going to be 3 types of characters in each country, where we've got the working class or the middle class Chinese people, we've got the middle class American people, we've got the capitalists in China, we've got the capitalists in America, and then we have the cloudalists in China and the cloudalists in America. Those are our 6 groups. Oh, and the American capitalists, those people are tied up with the FIRE sector in the US, which stands for finance, insurance, and real estate. Like, those industries are really well tied in with the power holders in the capitalist American class. Now, our story is going to start before the cloudalist age. It starts back in the age of what he's calling the Minotaur, or the money pump. And he's actually going to call this the dark deal, which is the deal that cuts the middle class, both in the US and also in China. It cuts those groups out of growing economic value. So if we do think of this as a money pump, that money pump is going to point toward American capitalists in the age of the Minotaur. And what about Chinese capitalists? Like, what is their role in this? And the Chinese capitalists actually do get a little bit of rent. Like, they get to cut their share of the pie as the resources are moving toward the American finance sector. But certainly the Chinese middle class and the American middle class, both of those groups lose out. So this is kind of the way I look at the money pump and how it operated before the cloudalists came on the scene. In which case, the global supply chain is part of this money pump channeling resources toward the FIRE sector in the US. And this setup depends on the dollar as the reserve currency. Like, that's undermining this global supply chain, such that if we ask, what do these toll booths in this rentier situation look like? Part of those tolls are taken when other countries have to transfer their money, their currency into dollars to operate on the global supply chain. Now, what happened when cloud capital came on the scene? How did that change this story? And he says, if my hypothesis is right, cloud capital is overpowering terrestrial capital, sucking cloud rent increasingly out of the global supply chain. And how this happens relates to the fact that cloud capital is going to offer an alternative to using the dollar as a reserve currency. So we might think of this as a German factory, where the German factory is going to buy stuff from the Chinese markets as inputs into whatever they're doing in this German factory. And in the old era of the Minotaur, this German factory would have to use their euros to buy dollars, and with those dollars, then they could translate that into the Chinese markets. And basically getting the goods from China to this German company required relying on the dollar as the reserve currency. And so, of course, the question is is that really necessary? And he says, is there a reason why such an unwieldy process has survived the wonders of the digital age? Of course there is. Its clunkiness and mind-boggling inefficiency is a source of rent, as each private banker and go-between involved in such transfers takes a small cut. Taken together, these cuts amount to a fortune. Now, how does cloud capital change that situation? And the answer is Chinese cloudalists can offer an app on the phone where they can offer this to the German manufacturer. They can say to the German manufacturer, if you just download our app, you're not going to have to buy dollars. You're not going to have to go through this unwieldy process to buy goods from China. You can actually just do it directly on the app without involving the dollar as the reserve currency. In other words, if the global supply chain has sections of the river that are owned by the fire sector in the US that have heavy tolls or many, many different tolls, maybe it's not heavy, maybe each of them is small, the Chinese cloudalists can say, actually, we're going to cut the global supply chain off from those parts of the river where the US fire sector is collecting their tolls. Now, the ironic thing about this situation is that the Chinese capitalists actually depend on the system that involves the US dollar. Like, he's saying the Chinese capitalists could lose out because they're benefiting from the part of the river that goes toward the US finance sector. Like, they get their little part of that rent on the way to the US finance sector. So Chinese capitalists may not like being disrupted by the cloudalists. In which case, if we go through our 6 actors, the capitalists both in the US and in China, they're not happy about being disrupted in this way. The Chinese cloudalists, of course, are super happy about it. What about the American cloudalists? Are the people who run these digital industries in the US, are those people going to win out or lose out? And the thing about this is we don't actually know, according to him. If Chinese surplus value no longer migrates at the same rate to the United States, American rentiers will be in trouble. Their misfortune will ricochet back to the Chinese capitalists, who are so very dependent on America's net imports, which are in turn maintained by dollar-dominated rents. As for American cloudalists, they can't know what to expect. While they gain relative power over capitalists and the rest of American society, the effect of the dark deal's demise on their bottom line is the great unknowable. And that quote, of course, implies that the middle class in both countries, they're going to lose out because, of course, the feudalist system that the cloudalists are setting up is disempowering them. But we don't know yet whether American cloudalists are going to be harmed so much by the demise of the Dark New Deal that channels the money pump in the direction of fire. We don't know if they're being hurt by that will be outweighed by their benefit as the new feudalists. That's the story of the new Cold War. Now, he ends the book with hope. And that hope rests in the fact that if this is hurting most people, like if most people don't want to live in this feudalist system under the thumb of the cloudalists, then we have the power collectively to shape a new vision. And what does that vision look like exactly? Well, he offers his own little possible vision, which is like economic science fiction of the future. I kind of love it. Now, I mean, you look at his particular vision, and for me, it doesn't look quite right for a number of reasons. But he points to a whole nother book he wrote fleshing out this vision in greater detail. So I'm actually not even going to comment on his particular vision. I may do that in another book, if so I'll link to it below. But he does see this as a possibility. And I certainly believe, actually, it's not going to arrive in anybody's brain fully formed. Rather, we're going to have a lot of different people with a lot of different visions about an economic future that's not technofeudalism. And the hope is that the population could in an emergent way move us towards something that's better. That's in some ways the hope. Now, I appreciated his perspective on the role of cryptocurrency and blockchain in this story. Because he basically says, if you look at the crypto communities right now, a lot of them are a little bit wrapped up in the existing power structure. A lot of them have not yet fully figured out how to get out from under the thumb of the system principle of power to the powerful. So he acknowledges that, which I generally agree with. But at the same time, he says, if we're going to get ourselves to a better vision, very likely blockchain technology and possibly even cryptocurrencies will play an important role in getting our economy to that better place. Here's a couple of quotes. Rather than inching toward utopia, crypto has become another tool of cloud finance and an engine for the accumulation of cloud capital. If and when we manage to socialize cloud capital and democratize our economies, blockchain technology will come in handy. Now, he uses the word socialize in that context. And of course, he has a different vision of socialism, I think, than I do. My guess is if we find ourselves in a better place like 30 years from now, and if I were to sit down and have a conversation with him, I would probably say, this thing we're in right now, 30 years into the future, this is not socialism. Like, it's not... Its foundation is not collective ownership. Its foundation is other things, even if there's partial collective ownership and partial private ownership and whatnot. I would not call it capitalism in my head and my vision. But he might actually, at this same table, at this same conversation, he might actually say, actually, this is always what I'd envisioned when I thought about socialism. And at that point, it would be a semantic argument. It would be like, what really was socialism? In my view, socialism is stuck in the visions of economics in the 20th century. It's not accounting for the possibilities of radically different systems. But in some ways, that's what he's playing around with in this book. What is capitalism? I'm asking the question, what is socialism? Is this better vision really socialism? And maybe for now it doesn't matter that much. So that's the end of the story. Capitalism is dead. There's possibilities for a better future, but we have to participate in that today by envisioning different variations of the future where we're not under the thumb of the cloudalists. If you enjoyed this video, you'll probably also enjoy my review of this book, the Technostructure book that he talks about, that he's influenced by. I did a whole video explaining the concepts in this book. It's called The New Industrial State. I will link to it here and below.